The twin suns of Laravel burned red and gold over the glass towers of the Royal Summit Hall, where hundreds of diplomats, traders, and officials had gathered under one roof to prevent war between Earth and the Laravel Dominion and Lieutenant. Jason Rain stood near the edge of the platform, sweating in his formal Peace Corps uniform, wondering how he, a simple human pilot from New Houston, had ended up in a room full of aliens wearing shimmering robes and antennaed translator collars, trying to speak in 18 dialects at once. Things had already been tense, but they turned dangerous when one of the ambassador's hoverdrones malfunctioned and dropped a rare Terran wine bottle onto the Queen Mother's ceremonial, feathers nearly causing a diplomatic uproar. And Jason, acting on instinct, leaped over a table, caught the drone in mid-air, and rolled across the floor to avoid a blast of startled guard fire, which made everyone freeze in stunned silence. Princess Arali, standing beside her mother and wearing the glittering star-silk gown of her house, stepped forward and raised her hand, stopping the guards, then looked at Jason with a strange light in her golden eyes and spoke in high Laravellan. "He has shown the courage of the old stars and the humility of the sea. This man will be my bonded one." And before Jason could understand what that meant, the entire hall erupted into ceremonial music, and a legal scribe began reading off something in an official voice while the princess took Jason's hand and placed a silver ring in his palm, and he, thinking it was some symbolic thank you or cultural gesture, nodded politely and said, "Sure, happy to help," which caused a burst of light to erupt above them and 10 witnesses to bow in formal agreement, sealing what Laravel law recognized as a noble proposal and public acceptance of lifelong union, though Jason still thought this was just part of the ceremony or maybe a strange way of saying thank you, until a robed official stepped forward and said, "Human Jason Rain, by accepting the princess's hand and words under the hall of witnesses, you are now betrothed to Arali of House San, heir of the Pearl Throne," which made Jason blink, laugh nervously, and ask if they were serious, but no one laughed back. And then came the real twist and elder counselor, with scales down his neck and a voice like wind in a cave, added, "And as dictated by the law of shared honor, Section 9, any noble woman of House San who forms union with an outsider must extend that bond equally to her blood sisters unless each one formally rejects the claim," which made Jason's heart drop into his boots as he turned to see 4 more women step forward, a tall and sharp-eyed woman in military armor, who gave him a look like she was sizing up an enemy, a quiet one who barely raised her gaze, a smiling one with clever eyes holding a glowing tablet, and the last one, cool and unreadable, draped in a robe of judgment symbols, and the counselor concluded, "Failure to fulfill the multi-bond would be seen as disrespect to the house and grounds for legal imprisonment or exile," which left Jason speechless as Arali squeezed his hand gently and said, "Don't worry, it's only law." But Jason was already scanning the room, his mind racing with questions. How do you say no to royalty without starting a war? Why didn't anyone warn him about this before? And most importantly, was there any way out of this galactic mess without breaking someone's heart or Earth's first treaty with Laravel? Jason stood frozen as the 4 sisters approached, each one a mystery wrapped in tradition and expectation, and though Princess Arali stayed beside him with a calm smile, Jason could feel the tension rising in the air like a brewing storm, because These were not just any women. Each sister held power, influence, and a lifetime of responsibility. And now, apparently, they were all bound to him by ancient law. The first to speak was Commander Virel, tall and dressed in a high-collared uniform with polished medals on her shoulder, her eyes sharp as lasers, and she said in a voice cold as ice, "I do not have time for childish customs or untested men," then turned and walked away without waiting for a reply, which might have been a relief if it didn't feel like she could break him with one hand, if she wanted to. Next came Tlani, the quiet one, who barely looked up from her hands and whispered something soft in a language the translator couldn't catch, and when she did speak in Basic, it was only to say, "I sense your fear. It is not wrong to be afraid," before stepping back as if she could feel too much all at once. Then came Nari, the scientist, grinning as if this whole situation was a science project gone wrong, and she examined Jason like a strange bug under a glass lens, saying, "You must be incredibly lucky or incredibly foolish to fall into this situation, maybe both," before asking for his DNA markers to study the accidental bonding process. Last came Saressa, the judge, whose calm face didn't show anything at all as she simply said, "We will follow the law, nothing more, nothing less," then turned her gaze toward Arali and added, "Unless you choose to break tradition, which you never do," and Jason felt like he'd just been sentenced without trial. As the day dragged on, he was given a room in the royal guest quarters where every servant bowed and every corner shimmered with alien technology. But all he wanted was a quiet room and answers. Why him? What did the law truly say? And could he back out without insulting the entire Laravel system? But before he could think too hard, alarms rang through the palace as a solar storm was detected racing toward the planet, faster and more violent than predicted, threatening to disrupt communication towers and atmospheric shields across the capital. And while the royal family was ushered to safety, Jason noticed a group of Terran and Laravellan delegates stranded in a hover tram outside the shield range, sparks flying from its engine as plasma winds screamed overhead. With no time to wait for orders, Jason grabbed a storm-rated glider from a nearby hangar, activated its manual flight controls, and launched into the chaotic sky, pushing through lightning clouds and waves of burning wind, tracking the stranded vehicle by radar and sheer luck, finally landing the glider hard on a sloped ridge where he pulled each delegate out by hand, strapping them to his suit's emergency harness before gliding them back in twos while the last storm waves slammed into the planet's upper crust. When he finally stumbled back into the palace, singed, dizzy, and covered in dust, he was met by silence, then slow clapping first from Nari, then Arali, and even a quiet nod from Viril, whose lips twitched slightly like she might someday maybe smile. Later that night, as Jason sat in a quiet garden under the twin moons, Arali came to him, not as a princess, but as someone who seemed honestly curious, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." "But you did," to which Jason replied, "That's what humans do. We help people, even if the law didn't write it down," and for a moment the distance between them felt smaller, but just as he was starting to believe he could handle this strange life, Saressa entered the garden with a scroll in her hand and said, "Jason Rain, you must make a decision by week's end, either fulfill the multi-bond or face the consequences of treaty breach." And though her voice was calm, Jason could feel the storm inside his heart only just beginning to rise. Jason sat in the Royal Library, a massive hall filled with glowing shelves and floating scrolls, his head pounding as he tried to understand the ancient codes of Laravel law, while a soft-voiced translator drone hovered beside him, reading out laws in neutral tones, but nothing he found gave him a way out until Earth's ambassador, a sharp woman named Reva Das, slipped into the room and handed him a sealed datapad, whispering, "There may be a way, read the clause on page 73. And when Jason opened it, he discovered something strange. A section written centuries ago called the Human Exception Clause, designed when humans first joined the Galactic Union, which stated that if a human was unwillingly bonded through a foreign custom, the marriage could be made null only if the human proved genuine love existed between them and one party, and if that love was accepted and returned by choice, the multi-bond law would dissolve, freeing all others. Jason leaned back in his chair, stunned, realizing he had just 7 days to connect with the sisters and discover whether one truly wanted him, not because of the law, but because of who he was, and the others had to be willing to step away, which wouldn't be easy, because each sister carried not only personal pride, but duties that affected whole regions of the Dominion, and failure could mean offense, exile, or worse, a collapsed treaty between Earth and Laravel. That evening, he sat with Nari in the Botanical Research Dome, where she tested climate samples, and though she started their talk by scanning his heartbeat and teasing him about his sweat levels, she eventually asked about Earth's oceans. And as he described diving and coral reefs and storms at sea, her smile softened and she said, "Maybe we're not so different, you and I. We both like patterns, even in chaos." But when Jason asked if she could ever imagine choosing someone like him, she looked away and murmured, "I think I could imagine it, but I also imagine 1,000 things a day. Doesn't make them true." And with that, she left. Before he could ask more, on the second day, he joined Tlani in the crystal caverns below the palace, where she used her empathic abilities to heal wounded travelers, and she gently touched Jason's arm and said, "You hide your sadness. Well, but I feel your longing, not for power or fame, but for freedom." And Jason asked her if she thought love could grow in a place like this, and she replied, "Love grows where truth lives." But when he pressed further, she simply said, "I am not sure who I am without. My gift, I do not want to be chosen because I feel too much." And she faded into the cave shadows like a whisper. On day 3, he faced Commander Varel in the training dome, where she challenged him to a sparring match and knocked him to the ground twice before saying, "You're too soft for war, but you're brave." I respect that. And when he asked her if she believed in love beyond duty, she stared at him with those storm-gray eyes and replied, "Love is a luxury I do not afford myself, not when I command fleets." And though there was a flicker of hesitation in her voice, she left him, with a sharp bow and no further words. On day 4, Ceressa invited him to sit at the Hall of Judgments, where she read petitions from across the stars, and Jason watched as she weighed each case with fairness and calm, and when they finally spoke, she said, "You are kind, Lieutenant." Rain and kind men are rare here, and when he asked her if she wanted to be free of this binding, she said, "I want all of us to be free, but only if the cost is not regret." and Jason knew she was trying to do what was best for everyone, even if her face showed no emotion. By day 5, Jason found himself with Raleigh again, under the moonlight in the sky garden where they had first spoken in peace. And this time she didn't wear her royal mask, just a simple robe and her long hair braided with star shells. And she told him, "I didn't choose you just to make a statement. I chose you because in that moment you reminded me of who I wanted to be, someone brave, someone real." And when Jason asked if she would choose him again, knowing all this, chaos would follow, she looked into his eyes and said quietly, "Yes, but only if you choose me, too, not because the law demands it, but because you feel it." And Jason, for the first time in days, felt the knot in his chest loosen, because with Raleigh, it wasn't just about law or duty, it was about something deeper, something honest. As the week neared its end and the day of judgment approached, Jason prepared to stand before the council and speak. But he didn't know what he would say, not yet, because even with the loophole, the hardest part wasn't escaping the law. It was choosing whose heart he could truly hold without breaking the others. The morning of the heart test began with silence across the royal palace, as if even the wind held its breath, and Jason stood before a mirror in his ceremonial suit, his reflection showing a man torn between duty and choice, his heart beating faster with every minute, because today he would face the Galactic court and speak the truth, not just to save himself, but to honor the connection he had felt, the one thread of real feeling that had grown in a place full of laws and expectations. And as he stepped into the Hall of Stars, where thousands of delegates watched from floating platforms, and the 5 sisters sat on the high bench in their ceremonial colors, he felt their eyes on him, each one carrying her own hopes, doubts, and fears. The High Speaker rose and declared that Jason Rain had invoked the human exception clause, and now must prove, without doubt, that one among the bonded sisters held his heart, and returned that bond willingly, or else the ancient law would take full effect and bind all 5 to him for life, regardless of emotion or choice. And Jason stepped forward, clearing his throat, his voice steady but low as he said, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't understand what I accepted, but I know now that a bond means more than law. It means trust and time and something real." And he turned first to Virel, the warrior, and said, "You taught me courage isn't always loud, and though we stand on different paths, I respect your strength more than I can say." And Virel gave the smallest nod, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Next, he turned to Tlani and said, "You reminded me that emotions matter, that feeling deeply isn't weakness, it's rare and beautiful, and something I wish the universe protected more." And she gave a soft smile, tears shimmering in her eyes. To Nari he said, "Your mind is brilliant, your curiosity endless, and maybe if the stars had twisted a little differently, we could have built something strange and beautiful together." And Nari gave him a wink, but her smile held a trace of sadness. Then to Saressa, whose calm presence had often felt like judgment, he said, "You carry the law with grace, and in your silence I saw a heart that thinks more than it speaks. I thank you for always being fair, even to me." And Saressa looked at him for a long second, then slowly bowed her head. Finally, Jason turned to Raleigh, who had been watching him with unreadable eyes, and the room went so quiet that even the hovering drones stopped humming, and he said, You chose me before I even knew what choice meant, but now I choose you. Not because I must, not because the law demands it, but because when I'm with you, I feel seen, not just as a human among royals, but as a person, someone you listened to, laughed with, and challenged. I don't know what kind of future we'd have free be to, but I want to find out together. And for a moment, the world stood still. And then Arali rose from her seat, stepped down the long platform, and took Jason's hand in both of hers, looking at the council as she said, I return his words. With truth from my heart I choose him, not as law, but as love. And her voice echoed through the chamber like music breaking stone. The high speaker turned to the other sisters and asked if they accepted the release, and one by one each sister stepped forward, giving her blessing and her freedom back, not as rejection but as peace, and the council erupted into glowing lights. As the ancient law shimmered and shifted in the air, rewritten by choice and emotion for the first time in centuries. Outside, as the suns rose higher and the crowd cheered, Jason and Arali walked through the sky garden, hand in hand, and he asked her, Did you ever think it would end this way? And she laughed softly, replying, I hoped. And sometimes that's where everything begins. And Jason looked up at the twin suns above and thought that maybe, just maybe, this galaxy had a place for love after all. The palace halls buzzed with voices in every known language as news of Jason and Arali's choice spread through the Galactic Union. But not everyone was pleased, for the ancient laws of Laravel had never been challenged by a single word love, and though the council had approved the bond and released the sisters, the High Tribunal of Traditions had summoned a formal inquiry, claiming the law could not be rewritten by emotion alone. And so Jason and Arali were called once more to stand in front of the galaxy, this time not to defend their hearts, but to defend the idea that love had value in law. And when they entered the great tribunal hall, which was older than most stars, and carved from the bones of a comet, they saw rows of elders, historians, and legal scholars watching silently, while outside, entire planets paused their daily lives to see how one human's choice might reshape centuries of order. The trial began with sharp voices questioning Jason's sincerity, suggesting that perhaps he had used charm or confusion to manipulate royal tradition. But Jason stood calmly and said, I didn't change anything. I simply told the truth. And truth should matter more than fear. And when they turned to Arali, she didn't speak in the polished tones of a princess, but in the voice of someone tired of pretending, saying, We built our laws in an age when survival meant control. But now we stand in an age where trust must lead us forward. And her words stirred whispers even among the coldest judges. Still, some resisted, arguing that if others followed their path, the balance of power might shift, that nobility could lose the structure that kept order across 1,000 systems. But then Ceressa stepped forward from the gallery, speaking, not as a sister but as a judge, declaring, A law that fears change is no law at all. It is a cage. And Nari added, We have studied every bonding ritual in the archives. None were ever tested by the heart. And even Varel, known for silence in politics, said, I saw this human fly into a storm for strangers. If he is unworthy, then worth itself needs redefining. And as the voices of the sisters echoed through the hall, something began to shift. Not just in the chamber, but across the broadcasted feeds and spaceports, colonies, and stations, where ordinary people began to ask themselves whether bonds should be chosen, not inherited. Finally, the High Speaker asked Jason to say one last word to the court, and he stepped forward, heart pounding, and said, "I come from a world where we still argue over love, law, and choice, but what makes us human is the belief that no matter how strong tradition is, it should never silence what we feel inside." And his voice didn't rise or tremble. It simply held truth, and that truth was stronger than force. After long hours of debate, the tribunal stood, and in a moment that would be remembered for centuries, they ruled not only to validate the bond between Jason and Arale, but to amend galactic law, adding the clause of chosen union, stating that no individual human or otherwise could be bound in marriage or lifelong contract without free consent from both hearts involved. A law inspired not by war, science, or trade, but by a single, honest connection. The galaxy changed that day, not with a battle or a weapon, but with a choice. And as Jason and Arale walked out of the tribunal hall, hand in hand, greeted by cheers and banners waving from ships above, he whispered to her, "Do you think they'll remember all this in 1,000 years?" And she smiled and said, "Maybe not the details, but they'll remember that someone once stood up and said no to silence and yes to love, and above them the stars glittered like witnesses to a new beginning."